Recorded live from the mats of Radical MMA in New York City. The Martial Culture Podcast. Your source for in-depth combat sports and martial arts insights with Coach Rene Dreyfus and Matt Peters. Ring the bell and let's get it on.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Martial Culture Podcast. We took a week off, but it was for good reasons, and we're back and better than ever.
We are.
Renee, how are you?
I'm wonderful.
Good.
As usual. Best day ever.
Best day ever. Every day is the best day.
Every day is the best day.
Every day you wake up is a good day. We have an honor today. We don't usually get guests in the studio, but we have one today. So why don't you set the stage for our guest?
I have to say that I'm really inspired by this person, not only for his academic and contributions to society, but also for his achievements on the mat. I was very lucky to have met him as a student. He was my student, and because he wanted to expand his martial knowledge. His name is Thomas Abt, and he is a expert on violence and violence prevention. But I'll leave the titles to him. We encountered each other in our both martial journeys, and since he's moved up to Boston as he has a research position up there, but he still trains very, very regularly in jiu-jitsu and other martial arts, takedowns, wrestling, everything. And but he's coming out with a great new book. But I'll let you please introduce yourself, Tom and Thomas, and let's hear about you. Tell us about your background and what the book and everything.
Tell us your life story.
Sure. Terrible question. So first, let's get the titles and your background in order. That's a good place to start.
Sure. So I have this new book coming out. It's called Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. That comes out actually very shortly, and I've been working on this book for the better part of 3 years while I've been at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where I'm a senior research fellow. And previous to that, I was head of public safety for New York State, working directly for Governor Cuomo. Before that, I was working for President Obama. I was a political appointee in the Justice Department, and going all the way back, I got my start in criminal justice as a prosecutor at the Manhattan DA's office right here.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, right here in New York City.
That is a resume.
Yes,
I'm unqualified to talk to you. My goodness.
Anybody is qualified to talk to me.
What got you interested in criminal justice and violence prevention and the study of violence in general?
I don't exactly know what specifically triggered it, but I can say this, and Renee, I know that you remember this very well. And if you don't mind, since we're off the mats, I'm calling you Renee, not Professor.
Of course, no, and
is that all right?
Actually, I prefer people on the mats don't call me Professor as well, because I don't really like to go on titles. Most people in my academy call me Renee or Coach. I do like it to be respectful and formal, but this is kind of an off subject, but I hate how Western martial artists sit on their titles rather than on their day-to-day accomplishments, not past accomplishments, but you're only as legitimate as the training you put in that day. And that goes for every day. And, sensei, sabunim, professor, sifu, soke, let's leave that alone and let's understand that we're all martial students on our own martial journeys. Maybe I'm a little bit ahead of you in this journey because I've been doing it a little bit longer. Maybe not. I don't know. But we're all students together. And I really don't like to sit on formality of titles because especially in America, I think it's really abused. The best martial arts instructors I ever met were very humble human beings, but also, spoke with their actions and didn't expect respect. They earned it. And that's kind of where I'd like to be as well. So, always refer to me by my first name.
With that being said, please call me Commander Peters.
Yes. You can call me Master Splinter, actually.
The rat guy.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but yeah.
No, so, well, where were we?
You said you were going to, when we met, you said something about us meeting and you had an anecdote to share.
Well, so, Renee, as you well know, actually, no, I think I was going to talk about one of the reasons that I was drawn to this subject.
Yes. Yeah.
which is, as you very well remember, we're about the same age. When we were growing up, it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and that was the absolute peak of the sort of crime and particularly violence here in the United States. Just by way of background, in the 60s, rates of violent crime and property crime sort of slowly started to tick up. And with very few interruptions, they basically escalated until 1991. And by 1991, we had a homicide rate of 10 per 100,000, which was extremely high. By way of comparison, now we have a homicide rate that's between 4 and 5 out of so we're half as violent as we were. And so in 1991, or right around there, depending on what city you lived in, that was the peak. And then we started creeping down in many cities across the United States, not all of them. So growing up, this was an issue that could reach out and touch everyone. And it still can to a certain extent. But the level of fear, the level of attention, the number of personal stories that people had was broader. And in fact, in my work now, one of the central challenges is raising awareness among people who are no longer directly impacted, because this is, urban violence is still a huge issue for,
a certain segment of the population.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when we were coming up, it was
everywhere. And it's funny, but my most violent experiences actually happened before the so-called peak. I remember when New York this was when I was younger, in the 70s, when New York went basically bankrupt, and all the social fabric seemed to be falling. And I remember being on a train with my grandmother, and these, people came into the train and were very, very aggressive. And my grandmother goes, "Look away." And I still think to this day she had something in her handbag that she was ready to pull out. It was like this experience. It was like, it's just another day in New York. And nothing happened. They quickly fled. But, how are they fleeing from a 105-pound, 80-year-old woman? Well, I wonder. My grandmother never explained it, but I think I have an idea. And then the other time was violence touched me very seriously was when someone tried to kill me and set me on fire. A mentally disturbed person poured lighter fluid on me and tried to murder me. So I was about 12 years old when that happened, and grabbed onto my jacket, poured lighter fluid on me, and we also, in the Reagan administration, they had stopped the funding for institutions that deal with the emotionally disturbed. So we had this massive influx of street crime, but also of people who are emotionally disturbed. And it was a violent person who was also emotionally disturbed. And unfortunately, thank God I was okay. I was not as aware as should be. I was a young kid. But it was a moment of extreme terror, that was some time. And then I remember going to college and navigating about 40 or 50 drug dealers and users on my way to NYU, and the street crime was just fantastic, just super high. And I had to go to school armed, not with a firearm, but I had defensive weapons that that I would think I have to play. I was basically a middle class kid, but I felt on my personal level, I felt unsafe. So yes, I definitely, that was in the 88 to 90, 91, where, it was just not, walking around the subway was not safe.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so, this has been an issue that I've always been interested in and been connected to as my career in criminal justice has progressed. And so, when I got to Harvard, and I had a sort of chance to catch my breath, because I'd been sort of, as they call, these types of political jobs, they call it sprinting the marathon, because you kind of work crazy hours for very long periods of time. And you really don't have a lot of time to sort of pause and reflect. And so once I went to Harvard, I did have that time. And that's when I decided to put this book together. In terms of my martial arts journey, I started boxing when I was 18. then sort of did that on and off into my early 20s, and then I did something called V-Arnis Jitsu,
yes,
which we've discussed, which was sort of an American form of street self-defense. And I did that for a few years, and then basically just sort of used boxing as a workout. And so, when we met a few years ago, I think I was 42 when I started doing jiu-jitsu. I'm 47 now. Martial arts had been sort of part of my life, but I'd been kind of flirting with it, and I hadn't really done it seriously in a while. And I don't remember exactly what you said to me when I walked in, because I just happened to walk in off the street. But it was a world-class sales pitch. It was exactly what I needed to hear to get me to do this form of martial arts. I think one of the things that you said that was sort of incredibly appealing, which I think you probably have told other people, is one of the sort of really interesting things about jiu-jitsu is that it's a relatively open system where it's people are constantly innovating, throwing ideas, and people are constantly testing. It's empirically based, not hierarchical or tradition based.
Yes. And that, or to some extent, every martial art will have this interplay between tradition and innovation, and some oppose it more than others. There's always a reactionary element. Even in jiu-jitsu, you see the reactionary element. Oh, we don't like this newfangled guard. But the innovation element of jiu-jitsu is so much stronger than most other martial arts. And to me, I find that appealing. And I think the same is true with MMA. It's the proof is in the pudding. We don't care where it came from. We don't care what its lineage is. We don't care. As long as it works, we'll take it and try to fit into a piece of puzzle, you know? And that's to me the most appealing part of the mixed martial art and jiu-jitsu journey.
Well, I think an interesting example potentially, and you're obviously the expert, but is leg locks. Yeah. Leg locks in jiu-jitsu or Brazilian jiu-jitsu were kind of traditionally disfavored, but they broke through.
Right, but it's funny you should say that, because I never experienced that. I was a leg locker because I trained in Japan, so I actually came up from a leg lock game. In Japan, I learned Japanese leg lock game. And then my first experience with the jiu-jitsu person was Sal Ribeiro, and he came to train in Japan. And I tried to put him in a leg lock, and he's like, "Oh, very good." So there was no looking down on me for that. And the same thing when I joined the Machado organization. Machados were always very, very supportive of leg locks and leg attacks. And as I've been told, Hickson is too. So I never experienced, and when I went down to Brazil to live, they called me, the first nickname I had was Sapateiro, which means a shoemaker, because they're like, "Oh, you're doing leg locks." But then they decided that they would prefer to call me Raptown, which, whatever, it is what it is. But I never actually experienced that people looking down on leg locks. They always told me that, but every single person I ever worked with was open-minded, and if they caught them with the leg lock, they're like, "Well, you caught me with the leg lock." I trained with this one guy, and his nickname is actually very inappropriate, so I won't say it here, but he was Brazilian. This was in Teresópolis. He was a black belt under, I think, Bita, but I'm not sure because we're cross-training in different places. And yes, Brazilians do cross-train in different places. But his nickname was inappropriate because it's very insensitive. But he was nicknamed of a very historically horrible person because he would just take people's legs and just take them to town. And everybody respected his game. And he was the leg locker in Teresópolis. And nobody had anything but respect for him. So everybody says that leg locks were always looked down on. I don't know about that. Now, I do think that there's an issue with people getting hurt from leg locks.
Sure.
And so I remember my old instructor told me that when he was competing, all leg locks were in. But then they wound up, like 80% of the competitors got hurt. So they put in this was like way back in the 60s or something, I don't know when. But they put in all these restrictions for leg locks to keep it safe. And I do understand that because I've actually seen a lot of injuries. The other thing is, and I actually agree with this, if you look at the statistically analyze MMA finishes, and leg locks have always been about 2% of MMA finishes, because you do expose yourself to punches when you sit back for leg locks. So a very easy way to get out of a leg lock is to punch them in the face. So, for the original Gracies, the concept was to make something that was legitimate for MMA and self-defense. So the leg lock is not always your best option. Body control, learning how to pass the guard, get on a mount, take the back, and learning this body control was thought to be a little bit less risky, and also develops some fundamental skills. That being said, yes, I've heard that people will look down on leg locks a lot. So I won't disagree with you. But you're right. Now leg locks are this huge thing, and they definitely have always been part of the game. And I love how some people are mixing in different elements of different styles, whether you're drawing from the Sambo leg lock tradition or the going back to the old judo leg lock tradition, which is there. And you can see that's why Danaher uses that Japanese terminology, because he really researched those Japanese, fundamental positions way back in the katas, from the 1890s, and then he took it in a different direction. So you're right though, but the open-mindedness is wonderful, and it's great, but I'm glad that I said something to convince you to train. I actually have no idea what I said. I'm usually consider myself a very bad salesperson.
You said 50% off your first month.
Black belt. Give me $50 to get your black belt.
I think it was something along those lines, and it's actually something. I'm a blue belt now, and I train in Somerville at 617 Fight Sports with my Professor Carlos Neto. And one of the things
He's an amazing practitioner.
Yeah, one of the things I love about Professor Neto is he, like anyone, has a distinctive style, but he encourages us all to try different things, adopt different techniques. He brings in lots of different people, and so he sort of approaches the school in a very open-minded way. And so that's something I like as well.
We always talk about martial arts as being martial arts, but we don't see it as an art in the sense that, look, if you were Picasso's teacher, you wouldn't say, Picasso, stop painting like that. Paint like I do. The idea is not to make clones of yourself. That is narcissistic. And unfortunately, some Japanese martial art traditions fall into that because of their tradition is not that, but because a lot of Japanese martial arts traditions were actually influenced by the militarism of the 1930s. And the martial arts were designed to create as an extension of the, like what we call the ROTC program, where pre-boot camp, where we want to make automatons that can fit into this military box. So, innovation, creativity, your own personal sense of self, that is not what we want. We want you to be a box. And that's this box can go anywhere, and we want you to be a soldier and do this. So a lot of the, if you look at Okinawan karate, it's very much like open-minded. I happen to have a very good friend who's an Okinawan karate practitioner in Okinawa, and his family's Okinawa, and they're like, oh, go box, go do Muay Thai, go experiment this. They're very open-minded. But you look at Japanese karate, and it's very different, and that is due to the militarism and the extension of that militarist culture that they never really shook off. And it's like, let's be automatons. Now, if you're teaching someone to be an automaton, you'll never develop Roy Jones Jr. You'll never develop Mayweather. You'll never develop, Buchecha or, some artist. There has to be an element of creativity in what you do and your own personal expression. Like Bruce Lee said, it's a personal expression of movement. That being said, of course, there's right and wrong and there's fundamentals. But if you're negating or destroying someone's personal creativity, they're never going to be good. Right. And that is true for every martial art ever.
So your system, which, I get to when I come back to New York, I get to dabble in, and you're always very welcoming, and the school is very welcoming, which I love. I love coming back. You have a lot of very, specific techniques that you want done a certain way.
Yes,
and these
very
things.
much so.
So how do you balance that?
Right.
And when?
That's a great question.
When do you start telling your students, like, okay, start to innovate?
Yeah.
Does this work for you? Does it not?
Basically a blue belt. So that's a great question. I hope we talk more about your book in a second. but that's a phenomenal question. And it's this question is like constantly, like I have a student, Drew, and Drew is still white belt, but he's approaching blue, and he's very good. But I noticed that he has this propensity towards a certain move, which is the X guard. And I'm not an X guard guy. I mean, I do X guard, but I constantly have him drill a little bit more X guard into whatever fundamental we're doing. So I'll say, and then I have another student who's a triangle guy. So everybody should have their own little thing. That being said, at basic white belt, you have to learn the fundamentals. And again, it goes back to art. When you go to art school, you have to learn certain specific things of how to approach thinking about positions, thinking about leverage, thinking about this. Same thing in striking. If you can't throw a clean jab, you have no business, trying to, be Lomachenko. If you can't do a good hip escape in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you should not be doing berimbolo, which is a higher level move. There's a level of fundamental, and each system of control, whether it's mount, whether it's the triangles, every position is a little mini system. And you have to get the base 8 to 10 moves of that system. Maybe not. It depends. Some a little more, a little less, but basic game of that system, then go to town. And Rickson Gracie's idea of like what makes a blue belt. Wherever the fight goes, you have a certain fundamental understanding of what to do there. Whether it's, okay, you're in guard, you're mounted, you're in side control bottom, side control top, you're in, north-south, you have this, you're in the triangle. Wherever you are, you have a certain offensive and defensive understanding of the leverages and the systems of that position. And there's not an infinite number of positions, And so that's really what I have. And also my system is based on certain principles that I feel are really important for MMA and self-defense. And I'm those functional principles, like today we're doing arm bars, and we don't want someone to do an arm bar and wind up on the bottom and get punched in the face. As you commit to that arm bar, you have to maintain the top control and roll through the arm bar if somebody defends, and wind up into a position where you're not exposing yourself to damage. And you can see this in MMA a lot, especially with the girls. A lot of times they'll do an arm bar on the bottom, and then they'll get pancaked, like sort of like panini'd into like this. And then the person on top will just start throwing elbows to the head. And one fight I saw that was particularly brutal was Carlos Condit and George St. Pierre. And Carlos Condit tried like 4 arm bars from the bottom of George St. Pierre, and his head was just, he had 15 minutes of, or no, it was a 5-minute, it was a title fight, 5-minute round, 25 minutes of rhinoplasty done to him. His face was just like, rearranged, and it basically broke his career. Imagine if that was a street fight. He would be dead. There's certain things that would just happen that you can't do in MMA, or just, that the round wouldn't have ended. He would be dead. So those fundamental understandings of principles and systems take precedence over creativity in the beginning. Ground yourself in a good foundation. Then when you're ready, okay, go to town. And also I tell my students at a certain level, don't listen to anything I say. You find the answer. Now, maybe the answer is the same as mine. Experiment. Maybe you come to the same answer that I do. Great. If you don't, you teach me. But that's also, again, at the blue, purple, brown. That's where you go off and you be your own scientist. And then you don't really listen to me anymore, other than maintaining these larger concepts and principles. You always have to use leverage, position, angles, wedges, efficiency, good breathing, timing, things like that. When you have that down, let's see what you can come up with. That's kind of it's a hard road. And I think as an educator, you can say the same thing outside of martial arts. It's this happened to me when I did my grad work. There were certain professors who were so large in their conception, their students became like, clones of them, and they're not really thinking or doing any innovative research. You're like, wow, this is just, so-and-so's, professor. He's just, just the same old. You're not really expanding the debate. And I think that's true with every teacher. If you're a teacher who's a narcissist, you want to create automatons. If you're a teacher who really is involved in developing your students, you want them to disagree with you. You want them to think. You want them to engage you. You don't want to be always told you're right all the time. That's what I.
You're right, Renee.
I agree. I had an interesting experience this past semester with my students. I was teaching a class on urban violence, and I assigned the the sort of rough draft of my book. They had a sort of preview of the book, and so they all read through it. And so it was very interesting to see all the students sort of responding. And one of the things when the responses were not that interesting is when they basically just repeated my own ideas back to me.
Yeah.
And I tried, at the beginning of the class and throughout to say, this I'm assigning this, but I'm assigning lots of other readings as well. You don't have to agree with me. This isn't a way, you're not going to get a better grade by, signing on to the ideas in the book or those things. But I did see some people sort of just regurgitating back what I had said, and that is something that in future classes I'll try even harder to. Yeah,
it just shows me what a wonderful instructor you are, because I took this when I was at Columbia doing my master's. I took this, from class. I won't say his name. From Star, expert in Japanology, blah 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 blah. And I actually did something, an exam, and he's like, I could tell that he just wanted to be agreed with. And I actually scored the highest out of the entire class because I just repeated exactly what he did in a just, nuanced way. And he's like, he announced that this is what's such a great paper and this and that. And I'm like, this is garbage. And that actually turned me off to academics. And I'm like, okay, so this super famous professor just wants me to, massage his ego, not really think. And I've always been impressed with you, but I can tell you're not that kind of person. You're questing intellect, and you want your students to quest as well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm a particularly powerful intellect. I mean, I've spent most of my career in, public service and government, and, have really just spent the last few years. So I don't think of myself as, a big brain or anything like that.
Okay.
But
that's humility right there. He's pretty awesome.
But I think that one of the things that I am is I really am genuinely and conscientiously concerned with a particular problem, and I'm open to any information about that problem that will help solve that problem.
And coming back to violence, you said that there was this large uptick. And I know that there's also been a downtick in violence, and we're not always so clear on what those circumstances are. Can you explain, going back to, I'm sure the book deals with it, that what you think led to the upticks in urban violence, and what led the decrease in urban violence? I've heard many theories that say, well, it actually could have burned itself out through violence or this or that or whatever. But I'm really here to hear what you have to say about that subject.
Sure. So it's a challenging way to open up on the subject, because it begins with kind of a disappointment, which is this is probably the most important subject in American criminology. Why did crime shoot up, and then why did it drop just as precipitously? And the answer is we don't know.
Right. I've even heard there was the thing that said, well, actually, when abortion became more common, it was like some kind of weird,
so,
statistically speaking, it might have had some small
the
effect.
Freakonomics debate with abortion. Stephen Levitt, with a co-author, has actually just doubled down on that with a new paper. A lot of people raised concerns about that theory, and I think that those concerns were pretty well founded. And so it was pretty shocking just this year to have Stephen Levitt come right back and with another study. So there are leading. I don't want to sort of suggest that nobody in criminology has any ideas about this, but there are sort of leading theories.
The theory about the abortions, is that just saying that there's less people to do violent crimes in certain?
I think the theory was. Mothers who were unable to effectively raise their children because they lacked the resources and all of these things, if abortion was legal, some of those mothers would choose not to have those.
Yeah, and they would grow up, instead of growing up in horrible circumstances and then going into a life of crime, they don't exist, so then there's less crime.
That is a dangerous theory.
Yeah, it's
interesting, but controversial for sure.
It was very controversial, and it was questionable on the evidence as well. So
the other theory that resonated with me in my historical studies, you can see some of this actually played out historically, is that this is one theory, and I'm not a student of urban criminology. I brushed on this theory from a more historical context. Is like when incredibly violent peoples interact, and you can see this in Japan. When the peak of violence happened in Japan, what happens is all the violent people killed each other. So there's less violent people around, and you can see these peaks and valleys of violence in Japan and it coincides with the death rate of the violent age of 18 to 27. And so there's these valley of violence because there was this massive kill off. And I remember the violence that happened in the 90s, it got to a peak and then it started peaking off. I was like, someone had mentioned that, well, actually the violent people kind of killed each other off. I was like, oh, that's an interesting concept. I don't know how true it is, but
are we due for another?
But I, from a historical perspective,
is it still going down?
Yeah, no, I mean,
I'm shaking my head.
I'm sure. Yeah,
I'm not sure that that's the. I mean, let's put it this way: I haven't seen a lot of evidence to that effect. I mean, but demography, overwhelmingly violent crime is a phenomenon between and among young men. Both as overwhelmingly as perpetrators, but also the vast majority as victims. So something like 90+% of perpetrators of violent crime are men of any age, but something like 60 to 70% of the victims of violent crime, particularly lethal violence, are men as well. Does
that include like sexual violence, or just talking like?
No, I'm talking more about deadly violence.
Murder. Yeah, right, exactly.
Right. And that's something I should be clear about. There are multiple forms of violence, and I'm a specialist in a particular type of violence, which is urban violence, which is sort of roughly the sort of intersection between gang violence, gun violence, youth violence, street violence. It's not family violence. Right. It's not state-sponsored. It's not terrorism or the study of war or things like that.
Right.
And that's something that I think people don't always appreciate is that human beings have used violence as a tool in many different contexts and many different capacities. We have different physiological sources for violent behavior in our brain. It doesn't just come from one place. And so the idea that there is one unifying theory of all violence is not accurate. I mean, for instance, just to take two very different kinds of violence, there's what's known as expressive violence versus instrumental violence. Expressive violence is violence where you're that's driven by emotion, where you're angered by something. It's often committed in a very impulsive way, and that is a lot of the urban violence that we see.
Like somewhat performative, like
right.
For hierarchical structure.
Right. It's in reaction to a perceived slight or insult or these types of things. And so you contrast that with instrumental violence, which is violence that is unemotional, very rational, often planned out in advance, and is just done to achieve a specific goal. It could be a commercial goal, it could be economic, it could be political. And what you see is that when people are contemplating different types of violence, different parts of their brains light up when they're examined. And you can just think about it. When you're contemplating instrumental violence, you're on the hunt. Yes. You're focused. You're vigilant.
Yes.
You're not angry. Right. You have a objective in mind. Whereas when you're contemplating expressive violence, which is most of what the urban violence we see is, you get angry. You feel threatened, intimidated, so you respond.
Right. I know some in the martial arts circle, people sometimes refer to the performative play before violence is very often what's called the monkey dance, and to offset the rise in the violence of that moment, you have to understand that this person is performing this thing to maintain social hierarchy because of perceived slight or anger, and if you assuage that anger or say something like that, you can offset it going into a escalation. And I think that's an important part of understanding that if you're dealing with someone who is there because they they're trying to have some sort of social goal, and violence is a tool for that, but emotionally based? Or are they planning a home invasion and they're going to tie you up and, take everything you own and maybe kill your family? That's totally different type of things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also think that, I feel like it's very commonly understood that the deeper you get into more martial arts, often the less likely you are to ever sort of use them in some sort of affirmative, aggressive way.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is because as you get better at physically defending yourself, you don't feel those stimuli towards expressive violence. You're not feeling threatened. You're not feeling provoked. And even if you are, you consider alternative results. I recently was at a dinner party of all things, and it got a little heated. And
really?
Someone really raised their voice in a very aggressive way and sort of killed the dinner party. But
at you?
At me.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, it was – well, the interesting thing is they raised their voice and everybody got sort of tense, and I felt it myself. But I also, because of the training, I sort of was looking at it from a distance.
Yeah, I know exactly. Like your apparition outside of yourself, and you're just able to more logically see the situation from a calm demeanor. That's happened to me too, where people come like, and you're like, okay, buddy, whatever you want.
Yeah. And so I sort of looked around the table, and I was sort of like, I thought, what's the way that we can deal with this, which is the least uncomfortable for everybody here. Yeah. And I think it's not like 5 years ago, before I was doing jiu-jitsu, I would have flipped the table over or anything like that. But you definitely, there's a definite feel. And I have to say,
did you feel physically threatened?
No.
I mean, like, if you had no training, was he going to physically aggress on you?
No, it's certainly not going to, get up and move around the table at the restaurant or whatever. I mean, that would have been very surprising. But there is this interesting thing, which is that even in, quote unquote, civilized situations, I think particularly between men, the conversation could be, quite polite. But really, there's two chimps who are, underneath the surface, who are kind of beating their chests.
And let me tell you, no matter how civilized you are, and I've seen this I used to work in the private sector and in the finance sector for a very short time, and there was an interaction between people, and there was almost always some level of implied violence. Even if there was this fat old guy, but he would just get in your face and be like, I want this done by tomorrow. And the violence could be repercussions in terms of, disciplinary for your work, but really it wasn't. What he was is getting too deep into your personal space and getting right up into you. And it's the chimpanzee, beating your chest thing. And when I worked there, people would get really angry because I would not react the way that, I had to be meek, and I'm like, dude, I could kill you with my pinky. And people thought it was like, why is he not reacting the way? I'm like, oh, it's fine. It's once you're really trained, you're right. The level of stimuli that comes at you that intimidates you is very, very, small.
I would pay a lot of money to see Renee mad. I've never seen him raise his voice.
No, I raise my voice, especially when I coach. I raise my voice a lot, but I'm not actually angry. I'm like, let's go. That's my job as a coach. I raise my voice a lot. I'm intense.
You're the type of person, when you see them mad, know, I made a mistake.
When I'm really angry, I feel like the other person's won because I've ceded control of my emotions to someone else. And I feel like that's a loss of myself. If you've allowed someone to, and anger is destructive, it feels physiologically. So if somebody get you riled up, and I'm no Zen monk, it happens. But what I always do is I see it as a failure that I've allowed someone else to control my mental state and ruin my happiness. I'm on this life for a short period of time. Let me brush this off spend time with my wife, my friends, have a good time, and and just move past it. Now, if I feel physically threatened, which this was about 3 years ago, I was on a train and there was an incident where it could have gone to a state where it was actually more almost 10 years ago now, because that was before I was married. But it could have gone to a place where I would have to have drawn from all my training to stay alive. And it didn't go there, but it was very, very, very close. And I was not mad, but I had to go in the zone. And if I told you I wasn't afraid, it would be a lie. But I also felt that I had to control that and direct that energy. And it was touch and go. It was these two guys, and they were harassing a girl, and they were not good guys. They were not. And they were really harassing this girl. And I said, and then I knew one of them was armed. Absolutely 100%. Like, they're just those kind of guys, right? And they were in this train, and I wasn't angry. I mean, I was angry at the situation, but I'm like, I have to go. And he looked at me, they looked at me and looked at me, and it did not escalate, thank God. But there's that moment where I was like, thank God I'm trained, because if I'm not, I'm dead here. Otherwise, I just have to run away, you know? And, but I can't run away when I see someone in distress. I can't do that. I can't do that.
I saw one of those YouTube clips from the Gracies were on the West Coast, the younger generation.
Here on Halleck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they raised an interesting point. They were talking about an experience, their students' street to self-defense situation. And they raised something which I thought was interesting, which is if you're practicing jiu-jitsu regularly, a potentially likely scenario where you would use it on the street is actually not for yourself. It's, as you said, in defense of someone else. Because you're probably not going to put yourself in a situation.
Yeah. You'll be aware, or you'll just walk away, or yeah. That's actually true.
It's more likely that you'll see something happening to someone else that you don't think you can walk away from.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Let's get back to your book and
Sure. All right. So I'll
I'm sorry for dominating the conversation.
No, that's all right. Well, I'm fascinated by this, and if there's time, we should talk about the intersection between urban violence and martial arts, because I do think it's a great way to engage youth who are at risk of getting involved and diverting them in the right way. But the book broadly basically talks about urban violence as something that people tend to believe is this intractable problem that we can't really do anything about unless we're talking about the biggest possible solutions, unless we're talking about ending poverty, unless we're talking about banning guns or eliminating gangs or legalizing drugs. It's all about, the typical thinking is to address violence, you have to work from the outside in. You have to end racism, you have to stop inequality, all of these different things. And 30 years of rigorous social science evidence, meaning trying things, testing them carefully, and then seeing whether they work or not, again and again and again. The book is based on over 1,400 individual policy evaluations. Says that that's not true. That
really?
In fact, urban violence is highly concentrated. It doesn't concentrate among sort of large groups of people. It concentrates among a small, very small network of individuals. And it doesn't concentrate in quote-unquote dangerous neighborhoods. It concentrates in micro-locations known as hotspots. And so and a lot of this research really reinforces what people who I've interviewed for the book and who I've just come across in my travels doing this work, always say, which is like, if you live in a dangerous neighborhood, there are certain streets you go down and certain streets you don't. You know that even within this quote unquote dangerous neighborhood, there's safe places and there's not safe places. And also, that even within the most allegedly dangerous neighborhoods, most people are not involved in serious violence. They might have a hustle. They might be doing, this or that or the other thing. But in terms of people who are truly, truly dangerous in terms of the potential to, commit lethal violence. That's a small number of people, even in these places, and everybody in the neighborhood knows who those people are.
Is that I find this terminology slightly offensive, but I know that because of its racial overtones. But I know there was at one point of talking about the super predator. Is that what? That's not what you're talking about, though.
No, that the super predator myth was it is a myth because it's now been debunked. Was exactly the opposite. The super predator myth said, there's a whole generation of young men who are not going to stay in school and not going to get employed, and they're all going to become violent criminals. Right. And that's exactly the opposite of what I'm saying, which is that it's not about the demographics. It's about what you do with this very small number of people and this very small number of places. And so there's basically the types of solutions that work are things like a program known as focused deterrence, where you identify carefully what are the key gangs, in a certain area? What are the key gang members? And then you go to them and you confront them, not just as law enforcement, but with law enforcement with the community. And you basically give them a message. And you say, look, we are here to help you. But if you won't accept our help and you continue to commit violence, we're here to stop you. And so you present a message that's both empathy and accountability. And you make two promises. You make a promise to help and a promise to stop. And then you have to follow up, meaning that if people take that choice and they say, I'm ready to stop the shooting, then you got to help them. You got to help them get that ID. You have to help them clear their warrants. You have to help them with job training, all of these different things. But if they persist, then you have to make good on your other promise.
Right.
And
I think also sometimes there's lack of cultural will to extend the empathy element to criminals. That I think, especially on the more conservative side of the equation, why do we have empathy for these people? But I think that's a wonderful approach and very interesting and innovative.
Well, there's basically three principles to violence reduction in terms of the things that really work. Focusing on these specific people and places. Balance, meaning can't be all carrot, can't be all stick, can't be just law enforcement, can't be not involving law enforcement at all. And then fairness. So focus, balance, and fairness. And one of the things that we've seen in the United States right now is that we're really going through sort of a crisis of confidence in the criminal justice system. And we're talking about this as if it's all about cops versus advocates and activists. But what people don't realize is when people don't believe in the system, the community itself becomes more violent. Because if people don't believe in the police, they don't use the police.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when your cousin gets beat up, you don't call 911.
No, you call the other cousin.
Right.
Yeah.
And you guys, quote unquote, handle your business.
Right.
And that creates these cycles of retribution, the tit for tat, and it goes on and on and on. And so, legitimacy is not just about some pie in the sky idea of right and wrong and, people getting along in kumbaya. It really matters in terms of, avoiding violence.
That's wonderful. I look forward to reading the book in detail.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. It's interesting that we have this intersection of martial arts, and at the end of the day, I think a lot of us join martial arts for sportive reasons or exercise or things. But to me, there always has to be an emphasis on the martial, on your being able to defend yourself, and also, like you said, that when you train for real, when you really train, and I'm not talking about McDojo, karate, or taekwondo, or whatever. When you really train, like you said, you reap these internal benefits that make you less violent. And what we're trying to do at Radical is actually have a reach out to some more at-risk youth, so we can expand our growth to these people who might can kind of bring them to have a more positive way of looking at life. They can dial down the violence in their lives and also get in a place mentally where they're more of a positive to the community instead of a negative. I've already, on a smaller scale, I've had a few students like that, but the owner and I are trying to expand it on a larger scale going in the future, because I think the Marshall Path is always a path of that when done correctly and really is a path of growth and self-actualization, which means you're going to be a better version of yourself and probably a better version to the community.
I think that's true. I also think, and I think that, and I think there's some good evidence of programs that have been studied that, martial arts and combat sports can be an effective way of sort of working with at-risk youth. But, and this is important, kids who are really at high risk for violent victimization or perpetration, they got a lot going on.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
The idea that
one thing is going to help them is crazy.
Yeah, and so in my experience, the best sort of programs like these use combat sports and martial arts to engage, and they bring someone in because they're interested in these things, but they also then link them to
social services, and
cognitive behavioral therapy, treatment, all of these things. There's a great organization that I've consulted with called Luta pela Paz. It's a Brazilian organization called Fight for Peace, and it's boxing based, but it's now franchised all over the world, and it engages kids with the promise of teaching them boxing, but very quickly they can't do their boxing unless they showed up for their mentoring, unless they did this, unless they did that. And so I think it's important that while I think martial arts is an extremely helpful part of putting people on the right path,
it's no panacea. Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. 100%. I agree. Absolutely agree with that. You're dealing with a complex, multifactorial problem. To think that one thing could fix it is ludicrous.
Yeah.
But it can be helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, no, this was fascinating, and I guess we'll look out for Bleeding Out. And you said, what day is it? It's releasing?
So it's going to come out on June 25th.
June 25th, and I recommend it. And you have a reading here in New York also at that time, don't you?
Yeah, that day there will be by the time we hear this, the reading will probably be over, but it's on that same day at the Strand bookstore.
Do you have any other readings planned in Boston or anything, a schedule, a tour?
Yeah. So from New York, I go back to Boston, which is where I live now. Then I head to D.C., then to Baltimore, then to Chicago, then to D.C., and I also have St. Louis planned. So
we can post up on the website, on the Facebook page, a schedule of your readings if anybody wants to attend. All right?
Well, that would be
a busy summer for you.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah,
make sure you train in all the places you visit.
Yeah, well, I yes, Professor, I will do my best. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming today. This was fascinating.
I feel like we just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
But, time is finite.
Absolutely.
So maybe we'll have you back again sometime in the future.
Yeah, I hope so.
To delve more into violence. And then we got in a little bit of what caused it, but let's talk about next time how we fix it.
Yeah, preventing violence.
Yeah.
All
right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It was wonderful sharing the mic with you and interacting in a different way than we usually do.
Yes.
No leg locks today.
No leg locks.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll catch you next week.
All right.
Bye.